Insurance isn't our only passion at UFG Insurance. We're dedicated to supporting the communities where we live and work. We proudly offer our employees paid time off to volunteer. Their work is making a positive difference across the U.S. UFG's Go Beyond Award is presented to one employee annually for exceptional community service. Striving to deliver on our promises is more than what we do. It's who we are. For a company promising community support, think UFG.
Welcome to Iowa Ideas 2024. For those of you that weren't at any of the morning sessions, the conference is sponsored by ITC Midwest, and this is one of our sessions within the Economic and Community Development Tract, which is sponsored by UFG Insurance. This is our Creating Age Diverse Communities session, so if this is not where you're supposed to be, this is your time to leave. I do have to warn you all sessions are being recorded. Closed captioning should be available, and video for this should be available after. I'm Megan Woolard. I'm the Johnson County reporter for the Gazette. I'm going to be the moderator for this session, and I was hoping we could have each of our panelists introduce themselves. We can start with Laura, then go Melinda, Paige.
Thank you. My name is Laura Kopp. I'm the president and CEO at the Center for Active Seniors in Davenport, Iowa. We are a home and community-based senior center that focuses on activities and supportive services. We're the largest senior center in the state of Iowa and one of only two that's nationally accredited.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Melinda Hines at the University of Northern Iowa. I'm a professor in gerontology here, and a lot of my research focuses on purpose and meaning in older adulthood.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paige Johns, and I am the State Advocacy Manager for AARP Iowa. A lot of people think of AARP as the memberships and discounts, which is true, but the state office works solely in community outreach and legislative work, advocacy. And so that's my area of expertise, is the advocacy work within aging Iowans. So glad to be here. Thanks, Megan.
Perfect. I also did forget to mention that if any of our audience members have any questions for our panelists, feel free to put those in the chat, and we will try and see if we can get some of those answered. So for my lovely panelists, creating age diverse communities, can we talk about, what is an age diverse community and what is an age friendly community?
Yeah, I can start, and then on a broader sense, I know AARP covers a little bit more of a broad spectrum than perhaps what Laura and Melinda have perspective to offer, but AARP works in a lot of different arenas, but one of the big ones is livable communities, to your point, Megan, and we actually recently just released our rankings for livable communities across the country, and we measure our livable communities and age-friendly communities in a indexed platform type of sense, and we look at housing, neighborhoods, transportation, environment, health, engagement, and opportunity. And so there's a lot of different things that go into each of those buckets. But from our perspective, an age-friendly community is not only a community that is welcoming and accessible for older Iowans, it's also something that's welcoming and accessible for our youngest Iowans too. So from our perspective, an age-friendly community is somewhere where anyone of any age can really thrive and find purpose and meaning, and be able to access those things. And so I think, in our introduction conversation that we all had leading up to this panel, I think that that's something we all really resonated with and agreed on. And I know Melinda and Laura have different perspectives, but would love to hear from them.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No, I agree in terms of the inclusion aspect. I feel like people are often thinking about children and younger adults, and that's great. But we should also be mindful of older people. And by funding opportunities for them, we all make better, livable, more age-friendly communities. So definitely agree with that. And I don't think it has to be so divisive. I sometimes feel like people are pitted against each other. And the reality is that when we're thinking about age-friendly communities, we all win.
Yeah, I agree, Melinda. I think age-friendly communities are focused on lifelong learning, right? Not just 0 to 5 or 0 to 18, or while we're still in our education and formative years, but across the lifespan, because the more that the young folks understand about the older folks, and the flip side of that, the more that the older folks understand the younger folks, I think we come to common ground as to what the issues are in our community and how to solve those. We're better and stronger because of those things. I think investing resources into social and cultural and educational activities across the lifespan is what keeps all communities healthy and rich.
Well, Laura, that's a great segue for my next question. How can we make sure we have these kind of intergenerational relationships within our communities?
You know, I think it is about recognizing the need first, the benefit and the value that those kinds of programs bring. Unfortunately, we have somewhat of an ageist view, not just on older adults, but on older adult services and activities as well. And so there's almost this shame if you're going to live in an independent living or assisted living, or if you're even going to participate in activities at the senior center, you don't, at least a lot of what we hear is, I'm not old enough to go to a senior center. I don't need a senior center, when really what the senior center is trying to do is to help you to age successfully. So we've started engaging a lot in some intergenerational programming. We do a Camp KSI. We have lots of our arts and crafts programs that are geared towards grandparents and their grandchildren, because we know they're playing a bigger role in caregiving and caretaking throughout the lifespan. And so I think it's about recognizing that older adults still have value and have a perspective and skill set that they can bring to the table that can help create brighter, more well-rounded young people as well.
I think a lot of it is starting early as well. So how can we create those intergenerational opportunities in schools, right? So, you know, there's different curriculum that teachers definitely have to follow, but wouldn't it be interesting to actually bring in somebody who has lived through that historical time or who has served in maybe like the Vietnam War? Hearing that direct perspective, I think, could be really interesting. It also helps to reduce ageism, also maybe provides an opportunity for students to think about working with older people. You know, maybe I'm really connecting well, and this is a passion of mine, and developing some of those interests and skill sets prior to coming to college. You know, a lot of what we do here at UNI is trying to encourage students to consider a career working with older adults. And sometimes students don't even think about that prior to coming to college. And so we really want to help to change that.
Yeah, Melinda, when you just said bringing an older person in to share the perspective, so a couple things came to mind. So number one, I am fortunate enough to have all my grandparents still living, and that's rare. And my grandma is 83, and she still is a substitute teacher. And I can't tell you how many times she has heard from students, I've never interacted with somebody this old, or I've never spent time with an older figure in their life. And she brings a lot of just like historical context to conversation. She's like, I love telling the students that I used to make my own dresses, because they don't understand that concept. They don't understand that you don't just go to Target and buy a dress. Like, you had to make it from flour sacks and things like that. And she even would bring in fabric and say, which one would you choose? Like, what would your preference be? And the kids were just mind blown that, oh my gosh, like, you used to make your clothes. And then she really blew their mind when she said that they didn't have indoor plumbing, and that they had a dirt floor, and that she went to a one-room schoolhouse, like all these things. And like, that's not that far removed, right? Like, that's my grandma who had all of these lived experiences, but there are just so many kids who never have that exposure. And some of that is just, I think, our societal kind of the reverence we have for seniors. I think personally, I've seen a decrease in that. There is not as much of a respect element that goes into that. I feel like that's really lacking. And to your point, Melinda, I think part of that is the fault of our own, that we're not exposing people intentionally to those opportunities. I think that used to be far more prevalent. AARP has a curriculum called Disrupt Aging. And I know we talked about that as we were planning for this call, but Disrupt Aging is a curriculum that's geared towards college students, but could be applied at different levels. And it really stresses the idea of how you perceive aging may be really far from what's actually accurate. And there's some really interesting videos and things out there. And I would encourage anybody to go look up Disrupt Aging. It's a book that our CEO wrote, but it's also a curriculum. And I think to your point, Melinda, it's just finding those deliberate opportunities to make aging at the forefront as opposed to the background.
Perfect. Thank you all for all those answers there. Laura, I want to come back to something that you said and open this up for broader conversation. You mentioned aging successfully. Can we kind of talk about what does aging successfully mean? What do we need to allow people to age successfully?
Right. So that's different for every person, right? I have rheumatoid arthritis and some other health conditions. And so my aging journey, even towards aging successfully, is going to look very different maybe from someone who has cancer or diabetes or heart disease or has no pre-existing conditions. But what aging successfully means is, despite of and within that context, how can you age to the best of your ability and live your best life? And we know that things like remaining socially engaged, remaining physically fit, remaining engaged educationally, learning new things, having new experiences, those are great ways to keep our minds and our bodies younger and more vital and working for us as we age along, that journey. So I think it's different for everyone. We get to define that for ourselves. And I think sometimes we get wrapped up in, there's an elite athlete that is 70 years old. And if we haven't aged like they did, that maybe we're not aging well. But that really is an independent individual gauge, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And something that we had talked about too previously is that we're all aging. Sometimes individuals just think about people maybe in their 80s and 90s as older adults, but all of us are older today than we were yesterday. And there's great diversity between, 65 to 95 plus. And sometimes I think older adults are really lumped into a category. And there are so many differences, like Laura had mentioned, in different pathways for successful aging. But I think it's important to make sure that communities are providing those pathways for maintaining purpose and meaning in older adulthood.
Yeah, I think you two nailed it on the head, that so often, I know I hear it often, I'm not old enough to join AARP, or I'm not, you're too young to work for AARP. And it's like, yes, but there is, like you said, Melinda, a diversity in who our membership is, what that looks like, who we serve. And even what I consider old might be very different than what Melinda or Laura considers old. My background's in long-term care as a nursing home administrator. And so I have really seen some very old individuals. I had a resident who was 104, and I will never forget that. And like, to me, that is old. And so when people start talking about, oh, you're getting so old, it's like, you're 62. Like that, you got nothing. Like, you're good. Right. You're doing great. And so I think that there is also a familial perspective too, right? If all of your grandparents or relatives died young, then old might be really skewed in one direction. Right. And so if you haven't witnessed longevity in your life, I think your perspective on that might shift as well.
Something that you had mentioned too made me think a little bit about, so like centenarians, those who live to be 100 years of age or older. Yeah. I just saw this actually this morning. There's a new curriculum out from the Association of Gerontological Education that talks about trying to revamp the 100th day of school for elementary students. So rather than having students dress up like an older adult, which is kind of demeaning because it tends to be students coming with canes and things like that, why not actually feature centenarians or talk about centenarians? What does that mean? What does it mean to have lived 100 years? What have you seen? What have you been exposed to? And so I just think that's an interesting way to look at it and gets us away from some of those maybe negative portrayals of older people.
I love that. Where did you see that today?
So it's from I'm part of the Gerontological Society of America. And one of their realms is also educational resources, but I'll send it out to you guys because I think it's interesting, and provides actually templates for parents to send to teachers, principals about, hey, here's a suggestion about like an alternative to celebrate that day of school.
Well, I think to your point, Lily, like that kind of stuff, it takes more than just industry people to engage in this conversation. That anybody could hop on this call today and say, well, the people from KSI, UNI, and AARP all say that we should talk about aging differently. And that's great. But it happens at the dinner table. It happens in the grocery store. It happens in the car ride, like to and from places. It's just conversational. And so I think that that's a great point, that parents have an impact on that, and how we raise kids to interact with older Iowans has a real kind of ripple effect on what that looks like down the road.
I think you're right, Paige. What you said before about we're all aging, we're all older today than we were yesterday. My mom used to say, my today is your tomorrow. And creating that empathy and that understanding that, and I think that's where some of the confusion comes in. We can all relate to what it was like to being a kid. We all remember being scared, being unhappy, being in pain, being happy. None of us has ever been a senior before. And so it's scary and it's unknown territory, but realizing that we have so much to learn from this generation that's going through that now, I think is something that hasn't really caught on yet. And we really need to highlight the fact that we're all, if we're lucky, we're all going to experience what those that we're looking at right now as old are experiencing, and how can we learn from that?
Mm-hmm.
Going off of that, kind of how can we expand this conversation about aging and what it means, like beyond the dinner table to, future professionals, kind of in Melinda's case, and policymakers, and just around the state?
Well, I think it's recognizing that, our population is aging. And so, and there are so many people in Iowa who, are older. And so that's a significant portion of the people that we are serving. So getting our policymakers to really advocate on the behalf of older adults is, I think, a starting point, because you're going to be serving the majority of Iowa that way.
Well, and I think to your point, Melinda, part of that, so we work a lot within voter engagements and grassroots efforts on an advocacy basis. And part of that is encouraging Iowans to speak up to elected officials and say, I really want you to pay attention to XYZ issue as it pertains to older adults. I think culturally, we used to hold a much higher regard for the perspective of our elders and the wisdom that they brought. But I think I have seen just kind of a disintegration of that to some degree, that we just don't hold them in such high esteem anymore. And if anything, we view it more as an aging issue, when really it's just a fact of life, right? Like, it's not an issue that you need more support, but it's how we're getting to that support. And so I think encouraging older Iowans to speak up and say, hey, my name's Bob. I live in whatever county. I really need help with this, and here's why. And putting a face to that conversation, I think, is so helpful, because sometimes it's very nebulous. It's just like, oh, well, I know people are getting older. But when you have a personal story, a personal connection, and you can share that with a lawmaker, or, not even an elected official, but a leader in your community, that has a really strong impact. And the more that conversation comes up from a lot of different angles, whether that's healthcare, education, transportation, right? It all funnels in from a lot of different angles. And I think we have to have voices in each of those realms that are willing to speak up on behalf of older adults.
Absolutely. I think there's so many maybe hidden challenges that people don't speak up about. Maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they're prideful. But if our politicians don't know about them, how can we expect them to fix those issues? So willingness to disclose that, have conversations about it, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Laura, I'm going to come and pick on you a little bit. We talked before in this conversation about kind of misconceptions about what senior centers do, what programs they offer. Would you kind of go through a little bit more about some of those misconceptions and what you guys actually do?
Sure. We have a great time over at KSI. We have this philosophy of reimagine aging. So, seriously related to what Paige talks about with disrupt aging. But let's reimagine what that is. So, we have seniors that arrive to our center on Harleys, and we have folks that, you walk in and I hear the same music my kids are listening to on the radio playing at the center as they're doing Zumba and line dancing and doing whatever. But I think, the one thing that senior centers bring to the table is they are community based. And so, you can create programming that is meeting your unique community, based just on who identifies, as a senior, what assets you have in your community. For example, Davenport is right on the Mississippi River. So we do a lot of things that are related to the Mississippi and being outside and water safety and, those kinds of things. But I think senior centers offer an opportunity for folks to engage with individuals that are experiencing the same things that they do. So we have a fitness center, for example, and we provide thousands of activities every year, and a good portion of those are based on health and wellness or exercise. And what we hear a lot is the why is great, and these other gyms like Anytime Fitness, and I'm not picking on anybody, but just to name a few, those are great, but I don't want to go and be next to someone who's 24 who is able to do so much more than I am. They don't understand at that center that, I've had knee replacement surgery and I just can't move that way, or I have diabetes and I need help with foot care, or, any of these other different things. And I think they enjoy coming to a center where they are surrounded by people that are facing the same challenges, that are in the same stage of life. And then they can build those personal relationships too, which are so important for successful aging, is not being isolated, not being alone, and having meaningful connections with other people.
I'm just going to keep going around. Oh, go ahead, Paige.
Laura, what's so interesting is the rhetoric that you're using surrounding community and how important it is. That is irrespective of age, right? Like regardless of how old you are, there is an importance that everybody says, oh, in your 20s, it's so important to build that network of people. And it's like, that's still important when you're 80. That doesn't go away magically. You still need people, and you still need that connection. We're built for that connection. But to your point, we can have tailored experiences for populations of people to meet their specific subset of needs. If I were, deaf, you wouldn't ask me to only engage in things that hearing individuals could do, right? And so there is that fine line between, we want to offer tailored experiences without making people feel like that's the only option for you. Because if you want to go to that gym and be next to the 24-year-old, go for it. Why not? Like that, and it really comes down to that personal preference. But I think it's acknowledging that preference exists, and that we have to give people the opportunity to self-select where they would like to go in that instance.
I think you're so right, Paige. It's about having diversity of programming as well, and not being the only place that folks can go. But I think, we're seeing with this baby boomer boom, this population boom that we're seeing with the baby boomers, you're seeing that first generation of folks who were open to be part of the LGBTQIA community. We're seeing those individuals that were diagnosed with HIV. We are seeing folks we have seniors that come in and say, I've never had a tattoo. Where can I go get a tattoo? And everyone just looks around and go, really? Like, you're 70 years old, but why is it surprising that they want to have a tattoo or go get a piercing? Or, there's all of these experiences that maybe they haven't had a chance to have yet, and now they want to. That doesn't just stop. And so I think recognizing that, we talked on one of the previous calls that, childhood is age 0 to 18, maybe 24 when we get out of college. But being a senior, think about when we start getting those cards about the Black Death and all of those things, is 50, and it's 50 to over 100. And so there's a lot of time and a lot of experience and a lot of learning still at this stage of our lives. And to ignore that, or to try to even pigeonhole that into one experience, I think is very short-sighted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's so much potential, I think, to really offer meaningful opportunities for older adults to remain engaged. I was also thinking a little bit about like the diversity and meeting different needs, and a lot of my work focuses on purpose and meaning with older men. And how do we keep them engaged? Because men, as compared to women, are more at risk for social isolation in older adulthood and are less likely to have maintained their social networks compared to women. And so when men retire, it can be trickier for them to seek out friends, have that camaraderie. So spaces like you mentioned, Laura, like the senior center, are a great way to build those relationships. Um, some of you might be familiar with like men's sheds as well around the world. So I've done some work with men's sheds in Ireland and here in the US, but it's a grassroots gathering place for men to do projects together. And then the idea is that men talk better like shoulder to shoulder while they're doing a project rather than having an intimate conversation across from each other. But that is an avenue for men to feel comfortable and safe, maybe opening up about a health concern, something that's on their minds that they may be less likely to do in a setting where maybe women are there as well.
I think you bring up a great point, Melinda. I think also we have to be willing to address all topics or be open to all topics. You know, what we see a lot with the folks that are coming to the center is maybe they've lost a spouse and they want to start dating. We had a gentleman drive over an hour just to come to the center because he heard we had Zumba and he wanted to meet one of the ladies from Zumba, you know. But also to your point, it's not necessarily a skill that we have if we've been married for 50 and 60 years. And it's certainly different. The dating landscaping is different right now. And so this gentleman had no idea how to approach a woman. And he said, my wife passed away just 5 months ago. I am very lonely and I want, basically he said he wanted to have sex. He wanted skin to skin contact. He wanted to be able to touch someone and hold someone. And so we had to have some conversations about how you go about doing that. You don't jump from, you know, coming to the senior center to jumping into that kind of relationship. But being able to have conversations and seminars and groups that are talking about sex, talking about dating, talking about death and dying. You know, we have to be willing, I think, as senior service providers as well, to have those conversations that other people find difficult to have because they're all thinking it. You know, a lot of us are dealing with the same kinds of issues, but no one's willing to bring it up. If you have someone at the center or, you know, that's doing an educational piece that is willing to open that door, it's almost like a sigh of relief where you can kind of look around and say, oh, okay, we're all doing that. Let's talk about that.
Well, I think you bring up such a good point. Where do you find the resource? And we hear that time and time again from people on two fronts. Number one, we hear a lot from adult children who are caring for their aging parents or grandparents. And that's a whole other like can of worms, right? Adult children as caregivers. I know we talked about this a little bit, but that is a population that I also think has to be considered in this equation because that support mechanism shifts, right? Parents become the ones being cared for. And that's a really challenging dynamic to kind of reframe your entire lifestyle around. But to your point, Laura, I can't tell you how many people I've heard say, I had no idea there was a tool for that or a resource for that or a website, a book, you name it. I mean, I think most of us in mainstream society today know that there is a website or a podcast for just about anything. But for people who may not be as familiar with some of those technological opportunities to find information, you do rely on places like CASI. Or in our case, AARP really has built a very trusted brand name reputation. And people look to AARP for information. And we do really view ourselves as an information convener and provider because we don't provide services directly, right? So we really rely on that ability to get people to the right place. And that varies from state to state, county to county, city to city. And so I think it's really important for local communities to build up that robust network. So it's not relying on only a national resource or only a statewide resource, because what aging looks like in Des Moines is going to look very different than what aging looks like in Fort Dodge. And so how we navigate those geographical differences as well, I think comes up in that resource options that you talk about, Laura, that not everybody can go to a senior center.
Right.
And so where are those resources and where can they find them, or who can they talk to?
It also makes me think about like technology literacy and who's filling that void with so many things being online. Well, if I don't have access to the internet or I'm not maybe comfortable with filling out this online form, I think a little bit about kind of like libraries and the who they're serving and the important role that they are playing just in terms of access and literacy with navigating some of those platforms.
Yeah, and we, on the digital literacy front, I am glad you brought that up, Melinda, because I think that is a really big component of age-friendly communities too, is not all of our information can be located in one place. We have to diversify our medium of information per se, in that some people do really still want a paper copy, and that's okay. You know, we live in a society where, oh, it's on your phone, scan the QR code, do the thing, and that's great. And for a lot of people, that works really well. But I personally, even as a 20-something, am like, I would rather read that on paper. Like, I'm not going to read a 13-page document on my laptop. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to print it off, look at it, and then, you know, put it in the shred bin or recycle it or whatever it may be. But AARP works a lot in the digital literacy space too. We do older adults technology sessions. We do everything from using a smart TV to using streaming services and things like that. But you make a great point that that partnership with local libraries, I think we think of kids in libraries a lot, but maybe not so much older adults in libraries.
Perfect. We've kind of touched a bit on this already, but I'm just going to bring it back into the discussion. Talking a lot about empowering people to age the way that they choose. Can we talk more about, you know, kind of what that means and how we do empower people to know that they have options and get them the resources to, you know, age the way they choose?
I think it's about having conversations. That's you have to be willing to sit down and have conversations with people and ask them, what does this mean to you? You know, what do you consider a good life? What do you want to do? What brings you purpose and meaning in your life that you can now focus on? You know, a lot of what we do at the center, the activities that we have, those are taught by volunteers. That's where we see our biggest engagement point, especially with the younger seniors, the 50 plus crowd, because their children have gone. They have more time now. They may be, you know, ending out their career. And so they have a little bit more flexibility. And they love to teach people about the things that matter to them or that bring them joy. And so it's almost double mission rich is what we call it, because they are helping us to maintain costs. They're teaching other people new and exciting things, but they're able to really focus on what matters to them and what brings them purpose and enjoyment and share that broadly with other people. So I think it's about having conversations. No one aging journey is the same. No one aging community is the same. No, you know, one senior center is the same, because we want to tailor that to people's individual experiences. There's nothing worse than wanting to have an experience and then realizing it's not quite a fit for who you are and what's important to you. So I think having those conversations is critically important.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about something that Paige had said earlier too about, you know, adult children as caregivers. So rather than maybe making assumptions about, you know, what your parent might want, making sure to have those conversations of like, what are you envisioning for your retirement? What things are you wanting to be involved with and how can I support that, rather than assuming, oh, you know, mom must want this, or, you know, dad definitely is going to go down this path. You know, maybe you're right, but you might be wrong too. And so just making sure to have those clarifying conversations.
Yeah, I think a lot of empowering people to age how they want is giving people the tools and the confidence to make the decisions still. I think as a nursing home administrator, a lot of the challenges that we faced was that lack of autonomy, and people started to feel that slipping away. And just like us, you know, when we were kids and our parents said you couldn't do, no, you can't have that extra cookie. the concept, it comes back full circle when somebody's then telling you, no, you can't have that thing, or no, you can't do that activity. You're not healthy enough. You're not mobile enough, whatever it may be, rather than finding a way to make it a yes. And absolutely, there's a time and place for no, right? There's a time and place for no that's absolutely not safe, or, that's not a good decision. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the everyday basic necessities of life, even coming down to what do you wear, right? The autonomy to choose those things. What do you eat? What do you wear? Where do you go? I think we undervalue that independence, and I think we take it for granted sometimes. As a country, as a society, you name it, we are really privileged to be able to do a lot of the things that we do. For us at AARP, a lot of the empowering people to live how they age how they want comes with where they choose to age. And there's a lot of diversity in that decision as well. I have met a few people who would prefer to age in a nursing home. They are more comfortable with the idea of that sense of security. There are professionals here. They know what they're doing. I wouldn't say that that's the majority, and our research says that's true as well. But I won't say that there's no one, right? There are a few people out there. The majority of people that we interact with in Iowa, I believe our last report was like 80% of older Iowans would prefer to age in their own home. And I think that's a really staggering number. But we have to backtrack and think about, okay, if 80% of people want to stay in their home, what are the supports that we need to have in place in order for that 80% to be able to make that decision? And to me, that is what it means to empower people to age how they choose, is saying, okay, Bob, you've decided you want to stay in your 2-bedroom house by yourself. What are all the things that have to happen in order for that to come true? Where are the concession points? Where are the points where you're going to have to make sacrifices and compromises? Where can we go above and beyond? Where are we falling short? There's no perfect answer to that question, and it's very unique to each person. I've already promised my parents that I will build them an accessory dwelling unit in my backyard and take care of them there. I'm an only child, so I feel like I really have to lock in on that commitment. But that might not be the case for my friends. I've actually told some of my friends this, and they're like, you are absolutely crazy. Why would you ever agree to that right now? And I'm like, because I love them. And I respect that that's not the choice, that some of my friends already have this idea in their head. They're like, oh, no, I'm sending my mom to a nursing home. I'm like, have you asked your mom? Like, have you asked that question? Because I think we often fall into this trap of the assumption that we are the ultimate decision makers, and sometimes that does come to fruition, right? Sometimes the adult children are the ultimate decision makers, but let's give older adults the ability to make the decisions as long as they can. And I think that comes with a lot of people having to provide insights in order to do that.
I was also thinking a little bit about kind of that trade-off between like safety and autonomy. And we are often prioritizing safety for our loved ones. And sometimes that really diminishes independence and autonomy. And so, what are the trade-offs? Maybe it is that, this older adult relative does not want to follow their diet. Okay, well, there's a trade-off to that, but that's their choice, right? So, rather than just being so exclusive with safety, I think it comes back to that conversation of, okay, here's maybe the medical advice you've been given. Where do you want to take this? What do you want to do? Do you want to follow it to the letter? Or, are you focusing more on making maybe some other choices that maybe also have consequences with them? I also liked how you mentioned page 2, kind of backing up and thinking about like, well, where do older adults want to be? So if it is aging in place, what do we need to think about from like an accessibility of the home standpoint? Do we need to think about modifications? Am I thinking about purchasing a different type of home that maybe has more accessibility, has bathroom, bedroom on that first floor, ramps, all sorts of things in place already, rather than being in a moment of crisis of, okay, mom broke her hip. What are we going to do? How is this going to work? So trying to back up and allow room for planning as well.
And I think so many people are afraid of that, right? I think so many people, I've heard from countless people who are like, knock on wood, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to speak it into existence. And it's like, that's when you find yourself in a heap of hurt, because if you're unwilling to address it and have the conversation while things are good and things are working well, imagine the hardship that you're going to find yourself in when you have no choice. And I think to Laura's point, places like KSI are a great opportunity and convening place for people to have some of those conversations with people who are going through the same thing. I can't tell you how many times I hear about new moms support group, right? Like there is a support group for everything. And I think older adults are no different. But maybe we just don't hear about it as much, or people aren't willing to like lead that conversation.
Because that's a great way to learn about new ideas too.
Yeah.
You know, maybe people haven't considered fairly simple, maybe inexpensive home modifications, you know? And so I'm maybe going to the senior center and learning about somebody who has implemented these things. Great. Okay, maybe that's going to allow me to stay in my own home for several more years or maybe indefinitely. But yeah, that's a great way to have conversations and ask questions, right? Like, how is that working for you? You know, what model of this thing did you choose? What does that look like? Absolutely.
When you just said like the time frame too, redefining the goal, right? Maybe your goal isn't indefinitely, right? Maybe your goal is I want to stay in my home for another 5 years, or I want to be able to stay in my home until it's no longer truly feasible. Because there are some people who it's just not feasible, right? Like it's just not going to work in your own home, and that's a fact of the matter for some. But being realistic too with what's really truly possible and saying, hey, you know, I'd like to stay here for 5-10 more years. Like, what are the interim decisions that we can make, and chunking it off in that sense too. I think a lot of people on the younger end of the aging quote unquote spectrum, let's say you're 50 something, the idea of planning for something in your 90s feels astronomically far away. And that's okay. And so how can we encourage people to plan for the next chunk, right? Like the next tangible chunk of life. And maybe that's a smaller increment. For some people, that might be 2 months. How am I going to do the next 2 months? Like what's that going to look like? But for others, maybe they have the capacity to plan for 5 years down the road.
Well, part of the reason this whole session kind of exists is because a lot of Iowans, you know, our population is aging, it's going to be older. I know we talked before this session about like the silver tsunami. Can we kind of talk about what the silver tsunami means, and just kind of circling back to, you know, how do we prepare for, you know, an aging Iowa population?
I think for most of us, we consider the silver tsunami this aging baby boomer population that is hitting our landscape by the tens of thousands every single day. In Scott County, Iowa, where KSI is located, in our community alone, the 65 and older population has increased by 40% over the last 10 years. That is massive. It's the fastest growing age demographic, including birth to 5 years old. I think I read an article recently that said that the older population is going to outnumber that youth population here soon for the first time ever. And so, you know, when we talk about, you know, what does that mean? It means it's important to be having these conversations. We have been having these conversations with the senior services arena for decades now because we saw this coming. But I don't necessarily think that at the ground level, that our local legislators, our local funders, our local decision makers realize the significance of that and what is happening. We're in the middle of it. It's not an eventuality. We're in the middle of it. And as we continue to see, you know, shrinking resources and competition for resources, and aging services continue to be kind of the last on the list for people to consider what is important in a funding matrix. I think we're really setting ourselves up for a disaster if we don't pay closer attention to that. So I think these kinds of forums are incredibly important. I think the Hill Day legislative advocacy kinds of activities are super important. but also just being on the ground level and going and talking. We just hosted a forum for candidates that are running for auditor and county supervisor at our center, because we wanted them to be introduced to our membership, and our membership to be able to ask them questions, but for them to really get a sense of what the pressing issues are for older adults as well, because I don't think that is naturally just something that occurs to you. We can all think of, the children are our future kind of philosophy, but what about yesterday's children? What's happening to them kind of thing. So I think this tsunami of older adults that we have is going to create its own set of unique problems if we are not proactive in investing resources and services.
We also need to train students, or to be working with older adults. I think there's sometimes the assumption that, well, anybody could work with older people, or there's not much to know. It's just kind of, simplistic. You'll figure it out. But there is so much embedded, like ageist language and how people communicate with older people that needs to be dispelled and talked about. And how do we approach older people? How do we make sure that we're conveying dignity and respect? How do you communicate with somebody who's living with dementia? The majority of people living with dementia are in our communities, right? So how do we best set up our students for that? And, at UNI, we're really passionate about that and making sure that students are going to be working with older people and that we provide a pathway for that, whether it's through our long-term care administration track or our social sciences track. So maybe you do want to work with older adults in residential institutional settings, or maybe you want to work with older adults out in the community. With that silver tsunami, you're going to have more baby boomers who want to participate in leisure activities, who want more lifelong learning opportunities. And so if we don't have that in Iowa, they might leave, right? Where are they going to go? If we're not meeting their needs, that's something to think about as well. Maybe they're going to relocate to other places that are willing to do that.
I think also, Melinda, you bring up a great point, but if we're not investing in those things ahead of time, the cost to our community is so much greater. Just the long-term care costs of individuals that don't have access to the resources, the engagement, the supports that are offered by these different community-based programs or elsewhere in the community, their long-term care costs are far higher, and their life expectancy is much shorter. And so, we have to think about what the impact is of that.
I think one of the other places when you talk about engaging future professionals in aging services, there's a couple things that come to mind. Number one, not every individual in gerontology works directly with older adults. And I think that there is a really interesting misconception about when you work in aging services. That doesn't necessarily mean you're directly working with older adults. I can't tell you, there are dozens of software companies, tech companies, product things that all support older adults, but never have a direct, you may never engage with your end user, right? And that's also working in aging services, and there's a big need for that as well. But then there is like you said, the direct service, and whether that's a nurse, a CNA, a nursing home administrator, a senior center individual. I mean, it does take a special person to engage with older adults. There is a level of respect, a level of interest and engagement and empathy. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it. And I do believe, Melinda, it shouldn't just be, oh, anybody can do it, right? Because that's not true. I cannot be a physicist, and there's a reason, right? That is the same way I would say, maybe you're not suited to be a nurse or whatever it may be. There are limitations to who's appropriate to work with older adults. And I think we have to be cognizant of that it's just like any other career. We wouldn't say that anybody could be a doctor. And so I think there's that component. But the other thing too, is that regardless of if you end up working in aging services, you are going to work with someone older than you in your workplace, period. There will always be someone older than you. Now, there are certainly, I'm sure, some exceptions, some tech startups, whatever it may be, that are all young guns ready to go. That's great. But we have now more generations in the workplace than we've ever seen before. We've got young 20s all the way up to people who are in their upper 70s, sometimes even early 80s that are still working. And so how do we equip people to have those conversations in the workplace? Because the way that I work compared to my 60-year-old coworker looks very different. And that's not right or wrong. We're both trying to do our jobs, but the way I approach something might look different. And so how can we prepare people for those interactions, and not to give it a negative connotation, right? I think you hear a lot of, comedic relief about, boomers in the workplace or whatever it may be, but everybody brings value in that sense in a different perspective. And so I think that's the other component of kind of preparing the next generation.
Definitely. There's a skill set that individuals who've been in the workplace for so long bring, right? That can really add value and mentorship to individuals who are maybe starting off. And sometimes I think that is missed in our society, but how can we learn from all individuals in the workplace from different generations is very important. And then I also think about just kind of awareness and like the language that we're using. So I think everybody is aware kind of like sexist language, racist language, but ageism is kind of like one of the last isms that some people will say is acceptable, socially acceptable. But we need to be okay with challenging that, I think, in the workplace and saying, actually, no, that's not really appropriate to say. That's actually misinformed because of these reasons. And we need more advocates, I think, pointing that out and calling that out in the workplace, frankly.
Well, I think to your point, ageism is not just on the older spectrum either. I've heard more and more from peers of you're too young to do the job that you do. I have several friends who have taken really high caliber roles and people are like, how old are you? Or do you have more years of experience than what I'm missing? Like all the different ways to get around to ask how old are you, right? Or are you qualified? And so I think to your point, Melinda, like that ageism comes in a lot of different forms and at different times in life too, but it's all operating under the assumption that older is either bad or better. Right. And so there is kind of that interesting dichotomy between the two of it can work on both ends of that spectrum as well.
But we're getting near the end of our time here. So I kind of want to ask you all, where do we go from here? We can have conversations like this. How do we actually make this, a priority that, out in our communities across Iowa?
I think we need to be talking with our local leaders and not to assume that just because those local leaders are involved with another population, that senior services doesn't somehow coalesce with that or blend with that. I worked in the child abuse arena for over 20 years. And the one thing that I always say is the same vulnerabilities that children in need face are the exact same vulnerabilities that older adults face. They are just opposite ends of that same bell curve. And if you don't have food or you don't have shelter, or you don't have protection, you are at risk. And so being willing to, cross-discipline, converse as well about how we can create a community that is age-friendly and age diverse, and how can we do more things that are in support of all aspects of the lifespan.
That's what I was just going to echo. I think for AARP, we will continue to be that trusted resource for older adults nationwide and in the state. And we really do serve as that kind of resource convener and information provider. But on a local and state level, we have legislative priorities that we work on every year up at the state capitol, and in cities around each and every one of us. So for us, we set our priorities and get to work on them, and they may come to fruition, they may not, but they take time. I mean, the average life cycle to get a bill passed is, I think, 6 to 8 years, right? It's not a snap of the fingers. And that's why I think these conversations have to happen on a continual basis. It can't be a one and done, right? It can't be, hey, aging is the hot topic now, and then it drops off, right? It has to be that continued drumbeat of why this is important in our society. And I think, you know, people like Laura and Melinda do a lot of great work to be able to uplift that in different populations of people, right? Melinda is serving students and Laura is serving the active seniors. And so how we can bring all of these types of people together, I just think is super important.
I also think about it's important for individuals in the community to think about making small steps. So maybe it is writing to your school district and saying, hey, I have an idea for the 100th grade school. Would you be willing? Or maybe I'm willing to come in and facilitate this. But I think it's those small changes along the way that are going to be helpful, as well as we wait for maybe some of those policies to move in the right direction.
All right, we have a few minutes left. Any last words from our panelists before we wrap things up here?
I just want to thank you, everybody, for coming to today's session. I think this is one of the first steps that we take in creating the next generation of leadership, but also bringing things back to our individual communities and making change there. So thank you to everyone who showed up today.
Thank you. It's been great to get to know fellow panelists, and I'm already thinking about opportunities to stay in touch and collaborate, and because we're all doing really interesting but different work, and how can we leverage that in unique ways? I would also encourage everybody, students, maybe young people in your life who are going to college, why not think about you and I? Why not think about gerontology? Would be happy to talk a lot about, you know, your different tracks and career paths with that. There are opportunities to work with older adults directly, but also indirectly too, as Paige mentioned. So yeah, would love to chat about opportunities.
Yeah, just echo everything that Laura and Melinda have said. I enjoy conversations like this because I think that through each of us, you can see that aging is a passion for us, and it lights me up to engage in conversations like this. And I think that when we can share that passion with other people, I always hope that it rubs off a little bit. I hope that people understand that it's not just a job, right? It's truly a passion point. And just like somebody might be really passionate about cats, I'm really passionate about seniors, and that's great and that's wonderful. And I hope that people can see that in the work that people like Laura and Melinda do, and, you know, find ways to uplift that. So I just thank you to Iowa Ideas for making this another priority again this year. I just really appreciate that.
Perfect. Yes. So thank you to all of you again for coming on here and, you know, sharing your perspectives. It's nice to have, you know, all of you work in slightly different fields, but as you said, like, we really can see, you know, that passion. You know, for our audience, thank you again for coming. I'm also supposed to let everyone know about the keynote address will be happening later at 4. Unlike this session, it will not be recorded. So if you missed that one, you missed that one. We do have another whole day of conferences. So if there's any other sessions that interest you, make sure to sign up for those and log on. And yes, thanks again to all of our panelists and everyone for coming to the session. And have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.